A Call for Freedom, The History of the Korean War. Good morning. We often hear the phrase, the Forgotten War, used to describe the Korean War. But for the millions whose lives were shattered by it, and for the world that was forever changed, this conflict, fought between 1950 and 1953, is anything but forgotten. It was a brutal conflict, a direct result of the Cold War, and a critical turning point in modern history. The division, seeds of conflict. The story of the war begins in 1945, at the end of World War II. After decades of Japanese occupation, Korea was liberated, but immediately divided. The Allied powers, specifically the United States and the Soviet Union, temporarily partitioned the country along the 38th parallel to accept the surrender of Japanese forces. The Soviet Union established a communist government in the north, led by Kim Il-sung, and the US backed an anti-communist government in the south, led by Syngman Rhee. This temporary line hardened into a permanent, ideological border. Both leaders, Kim and Rhee, were fiercely nationalist and committed to reunifying Korea, but only under their own opposing regimes. The simmering tension between these two nations became a flashpoint in the global struggle between communism and democracy, the Cold War. The invasion and global response. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army, KPA, heavily armed and supported by the Soviet Union, launched a surprise full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel into South Korea. Their goal was swift, military reunification. The world was stunned. The United States, committed to its policy of containment, preventing the spread of communism, immediately sprang into action. Crucially, because the Soviet Union was temporarily boycotting the United Nations Security Council, the UN was able to quickly pass a resolution condemning the invasion. This authorized the formation of the United Nations Command, UNC, an international coalition of forces from 16 countries, with the majority of troops coming from the US to defend South Korea. The War of Shifting Fronts. The war's early months were a desperate struggle. North Korean forces rapidly pushed the South Korean and UN troops into a small defensive area around the port of Pusan, known as the Pusan Perimeter. The tide turned dramatically in September 1950, with a brilliant, risky amphibious landing orchestrated by US General Douglas MacArthur at Incheon, far behind North Korean lines. This maneuver cut off KPA supply lines, forcing a massive retreat. UN forces pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel and advanced deep into North Korea, nearly reaching the Yalu River, the border with China. This advance alarmed Communist China. In November 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army troops secretly crossed the Yalu River, launching massive counterattacks that caught the UN forces completely by surprise. The UN troops were brutally pushed back south, and the capital of Seoul fell once again. The brutal winter retreat from the Chosin Reservoir became one of the most famous, devastating battles of the war. Stalemate and armistice. By mid-1951, the front line stabilized roughly where it began, near the 38th parallel. The next 2 years were a grinding, bloody stalemate of trench warfare and small, fierce battles over hills and outposts, while peace negotiations dragged on. One of the main sticking points in the talks was the issue of prisoner repatriation, whether all prisoners of war should be forced to return to their home countries, or if they should have a choice. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. It created the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a 2.5-mile-wide strip of land that serves as the border today. The lingering legacy. The Korean War officially ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty. This means that technically, the two Koreas are still at war. The cost was staggering. Millions of lives lost, including an estimated 2 million Korean civilians and over 36,000 American soldiers. The war cemented the global divide between democracy and communism, accelerated the US military buildup, and left the Korean peninsula fractured to this day. North Korea remains an isolated, totalitarian state, while South Korea has emerged as a thriving democracy and global economic power. The Korean War was not forgotten. It was a pivotal moment in the 20th century that created the world we live in today. Understanding its history is essential to understanding the continuing tension and hope for peace in the heart of Asia. Thank you.